Jim and Sandra Melgar had been together for 32 years. They were high school sweethearts and a quiet couple. They seemed to have built their lives on routine, faith, and history, but on the night of their anniversary, their life fell apart inside their own home. Jim was found dead after being attacked in a brutal way. They found Sandra alive and tied up in a closet. And from that point on, one question changed everything. Was she the only person who knew what happened that night? Or was she a victim who lived? Jim's full name was G. Melgar. He was born in Guatemala and moved to the United States when he was about 3 years old. His family moved to Houston. Sandra, who was then Sandra McCulloch, was also from Houston. They fell in love in high school, built a life together, got married, had a daughter, and became Jehovah's Witnesses. Jim worked in the tech field, where he was called an IT specialist or a computer programmer. Sandra worked in healthcare and was also said to have had a medical billing and coding business at one point. From the outside, they looked like a settled couple who had already lived many different lives together. Their home, though, wasn't like everyone else's. Sandra's health got worse over the years. Reports to the public and later advocacy materials said she had lupus, epilepsy or grand mal seizures, hypothyroidism, rheumatoid arthritis, and hip problems that required multiple hip replacements. Elizabeth Liz Melgar Rose, their daughter, said she had seen her mother have violent seizures more than once. She also talked about the times when Sandra was in a wheelchair and even partially paralyzed. Stephanie Davies, a family friend, said that Jim had become more and more involved in Sandra's care. Over time, he looked into treatments, helped with daily tasks, and took her home when she didn't feel safe driving because she was afraid of having a seizure. That piece of information would later become very important to the case because Sandra's health issue would be used in two very different ways. The defense used it as proof that Sandra was physically weak, and Sandra herself used it to explain why she couldn't remember what she said later. Their daughter would say that they were a very close family. She said that her parents were best friends. In public, there was no clear record of abuse, domestic violence, or a marriage that fell apart in public. That doesn't mean the marriage was perfect, though, because no one outside of the home sees everything. But it is important that the public record does not have the kind of clear, obvious trail that is often found in cases where a spouse is later accused of murder. The picture that came out at trial and in later reports, on the other hand, was much more complicated. A long marriage, an adult daughter, a quiet home, 4 small dogs, and a husband who had become, in many ways, his wife's caretaker. Sandra and Jim were celebrating their 32nd wedding anniversary on December 22, 2012. Sandra later said, and reports based on family accounts say that they went to their favorite Mexican restaurant for dinner. After that, they went to a CVS to buy mixers for drinks. Later, Sandra told the police that she remembered a car following them after they left the CVS parking lot, but she didn't say it was a clear threat. They made drinks, took off their clothes, and got into the master bathroom jacuzzi. When they got home, it was supposed to be a private anniversary night, the kind of quiet, intimate night that long married couples have because they are used to it and feel comfortable with it. Sandra later said they talked for a few hours while they were there. Around midnight, the dogs outside started barking. Jim went to see if they were okay or to let them in. Sandra got out of the tub and went to her closet to get dressed because he was taking longer than she thought he would. That was pretty much the last time she could remember anything clearly. According to what she told the police, she said that after she went into the closet and started changing, everything went black. When she talked to the police later, she said that she might have passed out after hitting her head or being hit, or that she might have had a seizure. She said that when she woke up, she couldn't move normally and hurt all over. One of the most hotly contested parts of the whole case would be whether that memory gap was real or not. On December 23rd, the day after, Jim's brother Herman Melgar and his family came to the house for a planned holiday dinner. What they found right away didn't feel right. The door in front was locked, the door in the back was locked. Nobody answered. Then Herman looked in the garage that was attached to the house and saw that the door on the right side was open. He found a locked but closed door inside that led to the kitchen. He went inside the house and unlocked the front door for the rest of the family. Then he heard people inside the house calling for help. He went into the master bathroom after hearing the voice and saw a chair stuck under the handle of a closet door. He found Sandra on the floor wearing a bathrobe with her wrists and ankles tied behind her back. After he moved the chair and opened the closet, she told him where to find scissors so he could free her while Sandra was being freed. Other family members found something much worse. They found Jim dead in the master bedroom closet. He was cold and naked. There was a loose rope around his chest and telephone cords around his ankles. He had slash and stab wounds all over his neck and torso, as well as serious blunt force injuries. Reports and court records said the attack was very violent, with more than 50 injuries, including 31 sharp force injuries. Later, prosecutors pointed out that Jim had defensive wounds on his hands, which meant he had fought back. The picture was scary not only because of the blood and violence, but also because everything was so close together. There was one closet with Jim in it and another. Sandra was still alive. The two places were close to each other, but Sandra said she couldn't remember the attack and never heard it happen. When police and EMS got there, they didn't think it was a simple home invasion. There were no signs of forced entry. According to court records, the doors and windows were fine. You could see the valuables. The drawers had only been opened a little, and most of the things inside were still there. Some things did look strange, though. There was a backpack in the garage with jewelry and a video game console in it, and things were turned over in the bedroom area, along with a white blouse and towels. Police also found a kitchen knife in the jacuzzi. The knife had Jim's blood on it, and police thought it was the murder weapon. The strange mixed signals would be the most important part of the case. They suggested a staged burglary on one side. On the other hand, they suggested that an intruder had been stopped. Paramedics looked at Sandra at the scene. She said she was in pain and had serious medical problems before she went to court, according to court records and later advocacy materials. However, responders did not find the kinds of serious injuries that one would expect from someone who had just been violently attacked in their own home. An ambulance worker who was cited in the appellate opinion said that she had bruises on her upper arms but no major visible injuries to her face, head, neck, or wrists. Sandra said no to going to the hospital and instead went to the police station to be questioned. She told the same story in that interview. Dinner for our anniversary. A stop at CVS. Time in the hot tub, dogs barking, leaving the gym, and then it got dark. She said she didn't know what had happened and that she also knew how suspicious it looked because she had been tied up as well. Detectives were very doubtful. They didn't seem to be able to believe that someone could be killed so violently in the next room without Sandra hearing or seeing anything. In the first few hours after the murder, police quickly focused on Sandra as the most likely suspect. The Innocence Project of Texas says that a detective tried to charge her with murder right after the interrogation, even though the crime scene was still being processed. However, those charges were turned down because there wasn't enough evidence at the time. Sandra wasn't arrested right away, though life moved on, at least on the outside. But the doubt never went away. Her family said she went from being a wife to a widow to a suspect almost overnight. However, investigators kept coming back to the idea that the crime scene looked too fake to be real as the case went on. The prosecutors came up with a theory of murder and staging. They said that Sandra killed Jim in the master bedroom and then tried to make it look like a break-in. They thought she opened the garage door so that dinner guests would find her the next day. They said she locked herself inside the bathroom closet and used a chair to make it look like someone else had done it. They also said that there was no forced entry, no clear evidence of stolen property, and that Jim's blood was only found in the master bedroom and bathroom area. The prosecution's version says that this wasn't chaos caused by a stranger. The only living witness built the scene in a controlled way. The state also used information from the body itself. The prosecutors said that the cords on Jim's ankles may have been put there after he died because he didn't have any marks on his body that would show he had been tightly bound while he was alive. A dry cleaning bag that was found near the ankle bindings made it seemed like the staging had been rushed and messy. The rope around his chest was not tight. The prosecution said these were just props and not real restraints used during an attack. The defense would later argue against that theory, but according to the state, everything strange at the scene pointed in the same direction. Sandra killed Jim and then changed the story. Sandra's medical history was another big point of contention. Sandra said she might have had a seizure or a blackout. The prosecution said that her own records proved that claim wrong. The appellate opinion explains how the doctor's notes were used to say that her seizure disorder was stable and that she hadn't had any seizures in a while. Prosecutors also pointed out that she only had bruises on her upper arms. They said that Jim may have gotten those bruises because he fought back during the attack. Her behavior after the murder was also used as evidence. A deputy constable said that Sandra looked like she was crying, but there were no tears. Police also said she was evasive and didn't make eye contact. These may seem like small things, but juries often see them as signs of honesty or dishonesty. The defense fought the case on many fronts. First, Sandra's lawyers said that the state didn't have any direct proof that she killed Jim. No one saw her do it. There was no admission of guilt. The appellate court was honest about the fact that the case was based on circumstantial evidence. Defense lawyer Max Serest said that the prosecution's theory made the killing almost impossible. Jim had been stabbed and beaten many times. He had wounds that were meant to protect him. Sandra, on the other hand, was a woman with serious health issues, including lupus, a history of seizures, and chronic physical limitations. She had already had hip replacements. The defense said that the idea that she could overpower Jim, attack him brutally, clean herself up, stage a scene, and then tie herself up was just a bunch of guesses on top of guesses. Second, the defense focused on what was not found. They said that there was no real proof of cleanup. There was no DNA from both Jim and Sandra under their fingernails. Sandra's fingernails weren't broken and there were no obvious injuries to her hands, which is what you would expect after a long knife attack. The state prosecuting attorney's summary of the appeal says that DNA that wasn't known to be hers was found on the scarf that was used to tie her arms. The defense also pointed out the backpack in the garage that had valuable things in it. They said that it could have been dropped by an intruder who was running away instead of being put there by Sandra. The prosecution called it staging, but the defense called it an unpursued possibility. The question of motive was never really answered. Prosecutors said that Sandra might have wanted to end her marriage, but as a Jehovah's Witness, she was afraid of what would happen to her if she did. In that version, murder was a way to get rid of social and spiritual shame, but that idea wasn't perfect. The appellate opinion says that there was no proof that Jim had been abusive or unfaithful, and it doesn't look like any of the witnesses at the trial gave a good real-life account of a marriage and its end. The defense showed a different picture. A couple that had their problems, like all couples do, but were still close, still living together as a family, and still making plans with relatives for dinner the next day. When the state can't clearly explain why a spouse would suddenly kill someone, that lack of information can be just as loud as any physical proof. A grand jury charged Sandra with a crime 1.5 years after Jim died. That gap was important to supporters because it made them feel like the case didn't start with hard evidence, but with suspicion that turned into prosecution. Sandra finally went to trial in 2017. Almost 3 years after the indictment. At that point, the case had already turned into a fight between story frames. Was this a wife who had set up a fake invasion? Or was this a victim who lived through it but whose memory and physical problems made her look suspicious in a case that was never really solved? Both sides told those stories strongly during the trial. The prosecution told the jury that Sandra had tricked Jim into being weak and then attacked him with a kitchen knife. They said she set up the scene afterwards, left the garage door open, and locked herself in the closet to make it look like she was a victim. The defense said that there was no proof of a motive, that Sandra's health made the theory unlikely, and that the state had turned a strange scene into fact without direct proof. At one point during the trial, the prosecution even used a demonstration in court to show how Sandra could have tied herself up. Later, after the conviction, the defense said that the jurors did experiments while they were deciding the case, reportedly tying themselves up and acting out parts of the state's theory. The appellate court later said that those experiments, even if they did happen, did not mean that a new trial was needed. The jury found Sandra Milgar guilty of murder on August 23, 2017. The next day, she was sentenced to 27 years in prison and had to pay a $10,000 fine for a family that had already lost Jim. This was a terrible ending. Their daughter publicly defended Sandra's innocence. She said she wanted her father's killer to be brought to justice, but she didn't think her mother did it. That dual loyalty, love for the dead father, and defense of the accused mother became one of the most haunting parts of the whole case. Watching strangers argue about guilt and innocence is one thing. It's a different story to see a daughter say that the man who died deserves justice and the woman who was found guilty did not do it. Sandra made an appeal in January 2020. The 14th Court of Appeals upheld the conviction. The court agreed that there wasn't any direct evidence in the case, but it said that the circumstantial evidence was enough to prove the case. The opinion talked about Sandra being in the house, the prosecution's theory that she could physically overpower Jim, the bruises on her arms, the open garage door, the idea that Jim was tied up after he died, the backpack in the garage, and what some officers said were fake tears. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals threw out the request for further review in June 2022, which meant that the conviction stayed in place, but that wasn't the end of the fight in public. The Innocence Project of Texas later took on Sandra's case, calling it an active wrongful conviction case and continuing to support efforts to clear her name. So, in the eyes of the law, Sandra is still guilty. Still, many people who have looked into the case don't know what to think. That's why it's still hard to write down the Melgar case clearly. The state came out on top in the case. The conviction stands, but the story never reached a level of clarity that usually ends a courtroom story. People still look at the same evidence and see two very different crimes. One was set up from the inside, and the other was misunderstood from the start. Technical case study. This was a circumstantial evidence prosecution that relied on how the scene was interpreted instead of direct proof. The state's case didn't have any forensic silver bullets that were very strong. There were pattern arguments, no forced entry, a spouse still living in the house, an open garage door, a chair wedged under the closet door, a murder weapon that matched kitchen knives from the house, and a victim who was found with bindings that prosecutors said were put on after death. The state was able to argue staging based on those facts, and appellate courts later agreed that a jury could accept that idea, but the case's technical flaws are just as important. There was no direct witness, no confession, and no clear forensic evidence that Sandra stabbed someone. The defense stressed that there was no strong evidence of cleanup, no DNA from both Sandra's and the other person's fingernails, and no obvious injuries to Sandra's hands. Even the state's theory needed a series of assumptions that Sandra attacked Jim despite having serious health problems, avoided important transfer evidence, staged the scene well enough to convince some people but strangely enough to make others suspicious, and then convincingly pretended to be a victim until the jury rejected her. That's why the case is still up for debate. Many people may think that the verdict is legally sound, but still not enough evidence. Reconstruction was also a part of the technical battleground. The prosecution used demonstrations to show that Sandra could have tied herself up and put the chair under the closet handle with a pillow sham. The defense said that those demonstrations were fake and didn't really show what was found at the scene. That matters because when a case relies heavily on figuring out what happened, the strength of the case often comes from how believable the reconstruction seems to jurors, not from the raw evidence. This wasn't just a case of who did it, it was a fight over which physical story the jurors were willing to see and believe. Analysis of the mind. This case is psychologically compelling because almost every significant behavior can be interpreted in two contradictory manners. Sandra's memory loss can be interpreted as the disjointed recollection of a medically impaired trauma survivor or as the deliberate ambiguity of an individual evading details due to guilt. Her few visible injuries could be seen as proof that she wasn't really a victim of a home invasion or that she didn't physically fight the way the prosecutors said she did. Her flat or strange affect could be a sign of lying or of being shocked, taking medicine, being sick, being sad, or having a neurological problem. This case shows us how risky it is to turn behavior into certainty from what is publicly known. Jim's mental health is more stable. He seems dedicated, practical, and very interested in taking care of Sandra. That picture made it hard for many people to believe the prosecution's theory because it meant that jurors had to believe that a woman killed the man who had been her caretaker and daily support. Prosecutors sometimes use that closeness to their advantage, saying that the person closest to the victim has the access, trust, and timing to commit the crime. The emotional paradox is what makes spousal murder cases so disturbing. Love and access are often in the same room. The daughter's role adds another layer of stress. Liz Rose spoke out in public in support of her mother while also saying she wanted justice for her father. That isn't just a sign of loyalty to your family. It implies that, at least from her viewpoint, the emotional veracity of her parents' marriage did not align with the prosecution's theory. That doesn't show that someone is innocent, but it does matter when someone who loved both the victim and the accused doesn't believe the simplest version of the story. It shows that this family didn't see the case as a clear betrayal, but as a break that never made sense emotionally. 5 questions that this case never answered. 1. If Sandra killed Jim, what is the clear physical link between her and the attack? This is still one of the biggest problems for people who don't believe the verdict. Jim was stabbed and beaten dozens of times, but the public record doesn't show the kind of overwhelming physical evidence that most people would expect to link Sandra to such a violent attack. The state was able to convince the jury anyway. But one of the most important questions that still needs to be answered is why there wasn't a stronger forensic bridge to, if someone broke in, how did they get in and out without leaving a clear trail? The state really pushed the fact that there was no forced entry. People who support Sandra point to the open garage door and the fact that there may be other ways to get in or out if there really was an outside killer. Though, the question is, how did that person get around the house, carry out a violent attack, and then disappear without leaving a more obvious sign of their presence? One reason the prosecution's theory was able to take hold is because of that gap. 3. What happened in the minutes after Jim left the hot tub area? This is the darkest part of the timeline. Sandra says that her memory is gone after Jim went to check on the dogs and she got dressed. The prosecution says that blackout story isn't true, but there is still no full direct reconstruction of those minutes. There are only competing versions in almost every big case. There is a time when the whole truth goes away. In this case, it's that stretch. 4. Why was the scene too odd for a normal burglary and too incomplete for a theory that it was a staging? The backpack in the garage, the valuables, the chair, the bindings, the knife in the hot tub, the blouse in the tub, the loose rope on Jim's body, and the open garage door. None of it makes a picture that is completely clear. The prosecution used that strangeness as proof that the crime was staged. The defense used it to show that the scene was too messy and full of contradictions to be understood with such certainty. People still argue more than 10 years later because the scene itself never stopped looking strange. 5. Did the investigation get too focused on Sandra too soon? This could be the most important question that hasn't been answered yet. Detectives may have looked at all the facts that came after they thought the surviving spouse was probably guilty. People who support Sandra think that's exactly what happened. The state, of course, would say the evidence justified that focus, but the risk is always the same in cases like this. Once a theory forms early, ambiguity starts serving the theory instead of challenging it. One of the most important questions in the Melgar case is whether that happened here. What do you think went on in the Melgar home that night? Was this a fake murder set up inside the house? Or did investigators get the strange and violent scene wrong from the start? Please tell us your theory below, and if you want more in-depth true crime stories told in strict chronological order, stay with me and subscribe.